2 grooms carry the water up a back stair in iron pails, passing them hand to hand so the king need never see the labour that makes this hour possible, and by the time the great tub is filled the room already smells of the herbs someone has scattered across its surface, rosemary and chamomile and sweet marjoram, drifting in a pale green haze on water that has already been tested 3 times against the inside of a servant's wrist before anyone dares pronounce it ready. The tub itself is lined with fine linen sheeting, tacked along the rim so that no bare wood will touch royal skin, and a second sheet, warmed at the fire until a hand can barely rest on it, waits folded over a chair for the moment he rises. Candles are set well back from the water. Someone has swept the floor twice. A physician stands near the door with his sleeves already rolled, not to assist exactly, more to witness, because what is about to happen in this room is understood by every person present as something closer to a medical procedure than an ordinary Tuesday. The king enters in a dressing gown of crimson wool, and for a moment, before the robe is lifted from his shoulders, he simply stands over the water and looks at it the way a man looks at a decision he has already made and cannot now take back. He is broad through the chest, still years from the illness and the girth that will define his later portraits, and in the low light his skin has the particular pallor of a body that spends its life inside wool and velvet and rarely sees open air. When he finally steps in, an attendant eases the temperature with a jug of warmer water poured slowly along the far edge of the tub, and the king exhales once, low, and settles his shoulders back against the linen. It is the year 1528. The place is one of the king's own houses along the Thames, and within these walls, at this hour, Henry VIII of England is doing something that almost nobody else at his court will do this year, or the year after, or very likely the year after that. He is bathing. It is a beautiful scene if you do not know what you are looking at. Candlelight on water. Herbs steeped like a garden folded into a basin. A king unguarded, for once, in the one room in his kingdom where his body is simply a body and not yet a matter of state. Paint it and hang it in a gallery and no one would question it for a moment. It looks exactly like what a modern eye assumes bathing has always looked like, a private comfort, a small daily luxury available to a man who could afford anything he wanted. Beneath all of that steam and candlelight and careful ceremony sits a truth so strange that it rewrites the entire scene the moment you learn it. This bath is not comfort, it is not routine, and it is not indulgent. It is dangerous, or at least everyone in this room, including the king himself, believes that it might be. The physician standing by the door is not admiring the ritual. He is watching for signs of harm. And the reason a king with unlimited water, unlimited fuel, and unlimited servants bathes perhaps a handful of times a year, rather than every morning the way we would assume, has almost nothing to do with vanity, laziness, or ignorance, and everything to do with what a Tudor physician actually believed happened to a body once it sat in hot water. What that belief was, why it made complete sense to nearly everyone in England in 1528, and what it meant for the courtiers who did not have a king's careful attendants managing every detail of the danger, is a far stranger and far more human story than any painting of this scene will ever tell you. This is 1528, and England is in the grip of a summer that will later be remembered as one of the worst in living memory, not for its heat, but for a disease that has already killed faster and more unpredictably than anything the court has seen in Henry's reign. The sickness has a name everyone at court already says with a small private shudder: the sweat, and it is currently moving through London and the surrounding counties with a speed that has badly frightened the king into abandoning his own capital. Every single person at that court, from the highest peer of the realm down to the boy who empties the privy pots, is navigating a daily physical reality built entirely around a medical belief the modern world abandoned more than a century ago. The conviction that the air itself carries disease, that foul smells are not merely unpleasant but actively dangerous, and that hot water opens the skin's pores wide enough to let that poisoned air straight into the blood. This is a video about what that belief actually did to a body every single day for the wealthiest people in England. Not a polite version of it. A real one. It means walking through why the Tudor elite, people who could afford absolutely anything, chose to stay dry for weeks and sometimes months at a stretch, and what they did instead to keep from becoming truly unpleasant to be near each other, because they did have a system. An entire sophisticated architecture of dry cloth and clean linen and perfumed powder built specifically to solve a problem that water was no longer allowed to touch. It means looking honestly at the disease driving all of this fear, at a king who slept in a different bed most nights of that summer because he could not shake the conviction that his own palace had turned against him, and at the strange, quiet irony sitting underneath the entire system that avoiding the tub did nothing whatsoever to stop the actual killer moving through the country, while doing quite a lot to make life very comfortable indeed for the lice. Before we go further into any of that, if the kind of history that gets left out of the state portraits and the school textbooks is something you find worth your time, take a moment to subscribe. It costs you nothing, and it helps this particular kind of careful, well-sourced history keep getting made. And if there is a stretch of the past you would like told this same way, the parts nobody wanted stitched into a portrait, leave a line in the comments. I read every one. Let us begin. As any honest account of 1528 must, not with the king in his bath, but with an ordinary body at that same court, one that has no physician standing by the door and no attendant testing the water 3 times before use. Let us begin with the man whose morning we are about to spend, because his body, not the king's, is the one that tells you what this century actually asked of everybody living inside it. His name is William Hart, and in the summer of 1528 he is 26 years old, a gentleman of the king's privy chamber, one of a rotating handful of well-born young men whose duties bring them close enough to Henry's daily life to dress him, to attend him at meals, to stand near enough during a hunt or a council, or, on the rare occasion it happens, a bath, that they see the private man behind the public one more clearly than almost anyone else in England. William is not a great lord. His family holds modest land in Kent, enough to have purchased him a place at court through connection and a little money changing hands, but not enough to make him powerful in his own right. What he has instead is proximity, which at this court is very nearly the same thing as power, and he has worked hard for 4 years to keep it. He is a tall man for his era, a little over 5.5 feet, with the kind of build court life gives a young man who eats well and exercises rarely beyond the occasional hunt. Solid through the middle, in a way his doublet is cut carefully to disguise. His hair is cropped close in the current fashion, his beard trimmed to a point the way the king now prefers his gentlemen to wear theirs, and his hands, which he is quietly vain about, are smoother than a labourer's hands have any right to be. Kept that way by gloves he wears constantly and a habit of avoiding rough work whenever he can arrange to avoid it. What his hands are not, and what almost nobody at court would guess from looking at him, is particularly clean, not in any sense the word will come to mean 300 years from now. He has not submerged his body fully in water in longer than he could accurately say. Possibly not this year at all. What is expected of William every single day is a kind of relentless, exhausting correctness of surface. He must appear before the king each morning in linen white enough to draw comment, in a doublet free of any visible stain, smelling, if he smells of anything at all, of the sweet herbal water his manservant splashes over his hands and throat before he dresses. He must never appear tired, never appear unwashed, never give the smallest visible sign that underneath the wool and the linen and the careful grooming is a body that has not seen a full bath since before Lent. And that carries, if he is honest with himself in the rare moment he allows it, a low constant awareness of his own smell that he has simply learned to stop noticing. The way a person stops hearing a clock they have lived beside for years. He is not alone in this. Every man and woman around him has made the identical bargain, which is precisely why none of them seem to notice each other making it. William's own closeness to the king exists, in a very direct sense, because of a formal decision about exactly this kind of risk. 2 years earlier, in January of 1526, Cardinal Wolsey drew up a sweeping reform of the royal household known today as the Eltham Ordinances, reducing the gentlemen of the Privy Chamber from 12 down to a select 6. A rotating handful that William has since worked his way into. The ordinance's own language explains plainly what it was guarding against. Warning of the confusion, annoyance, infection, trouble, and dishonor that could arise from sickly or unfit persons crowding too closely around the king's person, and among its more particular provisions, it granted the king's own barber the sole right to attend his grooming, a privilege that placed royal hygiene under the tightest possible institutional control rather than leaving it to chance. Even the king's dogs, which had previously wandered freely through the Privy Chamber, were banished outright under the same reform. William's place at Henry's side that summer exists only because the most powerful minister in England had already decided, 2 years before this particular season of fear, that access to the king's body needed to be narrowed, guarded, and written into law, precisely because that body was understood, at every level of government, to be perpetually at risk. There is one detail about William that would not survive in any court record because no clerk was ever assigned to notice it. He is, privately, a little more afraid of water than the fashionable medical reasoning strictly requires, ever since a cousin of his took a chill after wading a river 2 summers ago and was dead of a fever within the week. William has never told anyone this. He tells himself instead that he simply agrees with his physician, a sensible man named Dr. Griffith, who visits the household twice a year and has explained, patiently and more than once, exactly what hot water does to an open pore. It is easier to call a private fear a medical opinion. Most people at that court have found the same trick useful. This particular morning, William is dressing earlier than usual. Word came before dawn that the sweat has taken a groom in the king's own outer household overnight, a young man William knew well enough to nod to in a corridor, and the entire palace is quietly, carefully coming apart with fear underneath its ordinary rhythms of bells and breakfast and business. William's manservant is laying out a fresh shirt, the whitest one in the chest. Because if there is one thing a frightened Tudor gentleman can control on a morning like this one, it is the appearance of being perfectly, correctly clean. Let us follow him through that morning, and through the weeks around it, because his body, dressed and undressed, washed and unwashed, frightened and composed, is about to show us exactly what the year 1528 actually demanded of everyone living inside it. If you picture a Tudor lord's private chamber, you probably imagine a tub tucked somewhere in the corner, steaming gently, waiting for the evening comfort of hot water the way you might picture your own bathroom today. That tub did exist in a handful of the grandest houses in England. What almost never happened, even in those houses, is anyone actually climbing into it with any regularity. The comfortable assumption runs that the wealthy simply could not be bothered. That bathing was some forgotten peasant convenience, abandoned by an aristocracy too vain or too lazy to trouble itself with soap and water. It is a tidy explanation. It also gets the entire century backward. The actual reality is that full immersion in hot water was, to a Tudor mind, a medical event rather than a comfort, and a fairly serious one at that. The medicine of the age rested on a system inherited from the Greek physician Galen and refined across more than 1,000 years of Islamic and European scholarship. The belief that the body was governed by 4 humours, blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, and that health meant keeping those humours in careful balance. Skin, in this system, was not a sealed barrier the way we now picture it. It was porous in the most literal sense, a membrane that opened and closed depending on temperature, and hot water was understood to force those pores wide. The same way steam forces open the grain of wood. An open pore did 2 dangerous things at once. It let the body's own protective heat and moisture escape outward, unbalancing the humours that hot water had just disturbed, and it let whatever was floating in the surrounding air move inward, straight into the blood, with nothing left to stop it. This mattered enormously in 1528 because of what everyone already believed was floating in that air. English physicians of the period held, almost without exception, that disease travelled on foul odours, on the invisible corrupted vapour rising from stagnant water, unburied waste, and crowded streets. A belief scholars now call miasma theory. Bathe in hot water during an ordinary week and you were taking a real but modest chance. Bathe in hot water while a killing sickness was moving through the country, as one was moving through England that very summer, and you were opening every pore in your body to the exact substance every physician in the land believed was carrying death from house to house. A decade or so after this year, the physician Andrew Boord would set down England's first printed guide to healthy living. His dietary of health and its cautious, hedging treatment of bathing reads today like a man trying to write around a belief too widespread to contradict outright. Boord was not inventing anything new. He was writing down, for the first time in English print, medical reasoning that had already been standard practice at English courts for generations, reasoning that stretched back through university-trained physicians to Galen himself and would not be seriously challenged for another 300 years. None of this meant Tudor nobles considered themselves dirty or thought of full bathing as something to be missed. Washing, to a person of this era, meant something considerably narrower and more frequent than we now assume. Hands were washed before and after nearly every meal, since eating with the fingers off shared dishes made hand cleanliness a matter of basic table manners rather than hygiene in the modern sense. Faces were washed on rising. Necks, throats, and the insides of wrists were splashed with scented water as a matter of course, both for the pleasant smell and because these were the parts of the body that showed. What almost never happened was the full-body submersion we now consider the baseline definition of getting clean, and the reason it almost never happened had nothing to do with access to water, which the wealthy had in unlimited supply, and everything to do with what educated Tudor medicine sincerely believed hot water did to an open body in a dangerous world. A useful comparison sits close at hand in a practice modern readers already half expect from this period. Bloodletting, a Tudor physician who opened a vein to relieve an excess of blood or prescribed a purge to clear the bowels of corrupted matter, was applying the identical humoral logic that governed the bath. The belief that health depended on actively correcting an imbalance rather than simply leaving the body alone. Both procedures were undertaken deliberately, on a physician's schedule rather than a patient's whim, and both were understood as genuine medical interventions with real risk attached if performed carelessly or at the wrong time. Placed beside bloodletting and purging, William's rare, carefully supervised bath stops looking like an oddity and starts looking like exactly what it was. One more entry on a short list of procedures a sensible Tudor household undertook only when a trusted physician judged the timing right, and never simply because the tub happened to be empty and the water happened to be warm. For William, this reasoning was not an abstraction he had to work to accept. It arrived from his own physician, a careful, unhurried man named Dr. Griffith, who visited the Kent household twice a year and had explained the logic to him more than once, patiently, the way one explains something to a person who is going to need to explain it to his own household in turn. Griffith did not think William foolish for wanting to bathe on occasion. He simply insisted on conditions. A full bath, when William did take one, happened at a time of year Griffith judged safe. Generally not during high summer when the air itself was considered thickest with corrupted vapour, and never during any season when sickness was already reported nearby. It happened with the windows shut against draughts, the water blooded with warming herbs to counter whatever ill humour the steam might carry, and a period of careful rest afterward, wrapped and warmed, while his body's disturbed balance settled itself back into order. William's last full bath had been taken in the weeks before Lent, months earlier now. At Griffith's specific recommendation and under Griffith's specific conditions, and no one in his household, least of all William himself, considered this an unusual gap. It was simply how a sensible, health-conscious gentleman managed his body in a dangerous season. There were mornings, if William was honest with himself, when his own skin itched in a low, persistent way he had trained himself not to dwell on, a kind of background static under the linen that he had come to think of the way one thinks of weather, present, mildly uncomfortable, and entirely outside his control. He did not connect this itch to the absence of bathing, because in his understanding bathing was not the cure for it. If anything, an unsupervised bath during a season like this one struck him as more likely to make things worse, not better, by opening him up to the very air everyone at court was currently trying so hard to avoid breathing too deeply. So he managed the itch the way he managed most things about his body that summer. Quietly, privately, and without complaint, because complaining about it would have meant admitting a discomfort that every single person around him was also carrying and had also agreed, by unspoken consensus, not to mention. This was not a belief confined to the nobility, though the nobility experienced it with a particular intensity, since fear of the sweat sat heaviest wherever people had the most to lose. Physicians serving the merchant classes in London gave the same warnings. Rural households further from court repeated the same reasoning in cruder form, often without any physician at all, simply as inherited common sense passed down the way weather lore is passed down. Avoid the water when sickness is near. Keep the pores closed. Keep the bad air out. Living history researchers, who have since attempted to reconstruct the actual Tudor approach to the body, testing the reasoning under modern observation rather than simply reading about it, have found the internal logic startlingly coherent once you accept its starting premise. If disease truly travelled through the air and entered through open skin, then closing the skin during an epidemic was not superstition. It was the single most rational precaution available to a person with no other tool against a killer nobody yet understood. There is something worth sitting with in the fact that William's discomfort, and the discomfort of every noble body at that court, came not from ignorance but from a coherent, carefully reasoned medical system that simply started from a wrong premise and built an entire, internally consistent world on top of it. He was not neglecting his body. He was managing it, with real seriousness and real anxiety, according to the best information his century had to offer him. And critically, every single person around him, from the king in his rare and carefully supervised bath down to the lowest groom in the stables, was managing the identical fear in the identical way, which meant that nobody at that court ever had to feel alone in the itching, the low private discomfort, or the quiet daily decision to leave the water untouched. The historian Ruth Goodman spent 3 months in the early 2000s living according to reconstructed Tudor hygiene practices, no bath, no shower, nothing that would have struck a 16th century physician as dangerous, and at the end of that stretched the people working closely beside her every day. People who would have had every reason to mention it, never once complained of a smell. That single experiment is worth holding on to because it points to something the water taboo alone cannot explain. If Tudor nobles were avoiding all contact between skin and cloth for weeks at a time, the court would have been unbearable within a fortnight, king included. They were not avoiding cleaning. They had simply built an entire method of getting clean that never once required a full tub. The common assumption, once a modern listener understands the fear of water, tends to swing hard in the opposite direction, picturing Tudor bodies going essentially unwashed for months on end, dirt accumulating in visible layers the way it might on someone actually neglecting themselves. That picture does not match what the household accounts, physicians' manuals, and living history reconstructions actually describe. What they describe instead is a practice historians now call dry washing, and it was neither casual nor rare. It was a real technique, taken seriously, performed daily by anyone with the means to have a servant assist them, and it worked considerably better than its complete absence from modern memory would suggest. The method itself was straightforward, and almost entirely dependent on one material, linen. Each morning, a servant or the person themselves would take a length of clean, dry linen cloth, sometimes plain, sometimes a slightly coarser weave kept specifically for this purpose, and rub it vigorously across the bare skin, starting at the throat and working down the arms, the chest, the back, wherever the previous day's shirt had touched. The friction did real physical work. Linen has a natural affinity for oil and moisture, drawing sweat and skin debris away from the body the way a good towel does today. And the vigorous rubbing itself loosened the outer layer of dead skin and grime, enough for the cloth to carry it away entirely. Contemporary accounts describe this dry rub as leaving the skin faintly pink and warmed, glowing in a way its practitioners considered a genuine mark of health, a sign that the humours had been stirred and refreshed without the danger of an open pore anywhere near a basin of hot water. Rosewater or a light herbal water was sometimes used to dampen the cloth slightly for the hands, face and neck. Small exposed areas, everyone agreed, carried little of the pore opening risk that a full soak carried, but the torso, back and limbs were worked entirely dry. For William, this ritual opened nearly every morning of his life at court, performed with a briskness that had become so automatic to both him and his manservant, a quiet, capable young man named Robert, that neither of them thought of it as washing at all, so much as simply dressing. Robert would lay out the dry linen cloths the night before, warmed slightly near the fire if the morning was cold, and William would stand, arms raised, while Robert worked the cloth across his shoulders and down his back with real force. Force enough that William had learned to brace his feet slightly to keep his balance against it. The sensation was not unpleasant. There was a brisk, almost bracing quality to it, closer to a vigorous toweling after exercise than to neglect, and William looked forward to the moment near the end of the ritual when Robert worked the cloth briskly across his chest, and William could feel his own skin warming under the friction. The itch of the previous day's linen fading into something closer to comfort. It was, in its own way, a form of care, and William received it the way a modern person receives a hot shower, as the thing that made the day's beginning feel legitimate. Household inventories from the period, the careful lists great families kept of their linen, plate and furnishings, frequently itemized cloths set aside specifically for this purpose, sometimes recorded simply as rubbing cloths, distinct from table linen, bed linen, or the shirts and smocks worn against the body, which tells its own quiet story about how deliberately the practice was organized rather than improvised from whatever scrap of fabric happened to be nearby. A household serious about dry washing kept a dedicated supply, laundered separately and stored apart, the same way a modern household might keep bath towels distinct from kitchen towels without ever thinking of the distinction as remarkable. Some households supplemented the plain cloth with a stiffer brush of bristle or horsehair for particularly stubborn grime along the hands and feet, used before the linen rub rather than in place of it, though William's own routine relied on cloth alone, Robert having never seen the need to introduce anything harsher against a body he attended daily, and knew well enough to judge clean by touch and by eye long before any brush could tell him otherwise. This practice crossed every level of Tudor society, though its texture changed considerably with wealth. A labouring family with a single length of coarse cloth passed between household members made do with a rougher, quicker version of the same idea, rubbing down with whatever fabric was on hand before dressing in whatever clean garment could be spared that day. A household like William's, with linen enough to dedicate specific cloths to the purpose, and a servant with time enough to perform the rubbing properly, could manage something closer to genuine ritual, unhurried, thorough, repeated identically each morning until the sequence itself became a kind of comfort independent of its result. Physicians of the period approved of the practice specifically because it satisfied the era's central medical anxiety, stimulating circulation and clearing the body of corrupted matter, in their understanding, without ever exposing an open pore to dangerous air. It let the era have its cleanliness and its safety in the same gesture. There is a quiet observation worth pausing on here, before the morning moves any further along. Dry washing was not a failed substitute for bathing, a lesser thing people settled for because the real solution was forbidden to them. It was, in the minds of the people practicing it, the correct solution, reasoned out carefully and performed with real attention. And it worked well enough that a modern historian conducting the same regimen under close daily observation went 3 months without anyone around her noticing the difference. The tub sat empty in the corner of the great houses of England that summer, not because nobody had thought of another way to get clean, but because somebody very much had. For William, dry washing was only the first half of getting dressed for the day. The second half mattered just as much, and if you have been picturing his linen shirt as a simple undergarment, something worn quietly beneath the doublet and forgotten about, worth noticing only for warmth or modesty, you are picturing the least important thing about it. To William, and to every person of his class in 1528, that shirt was doing the actual work of keeping him clean. It was not an accessory to his hygiene. It was his hygiene. The reasoning followed directly from the same medical logic governing the bath. If the body released corrupted matter through sweat, and if that matter needed somewhere to go once it left the skin, then the answer was a fabric that could draw it away and hold it there until it was washed out, far from the body, in a tub of boiling water and lie rather than against living flesh. Linen, woven from flax, has a naturally absorbent structure, and Tudor households understood this quality well, even without any modern vocabulary for fibers or capillary action. Worn directly against the skin, a linen shirt, or, for a woman, a linen smock, pulled sweat, oil and grime away from the body over the course of a day, the way blotting paper pulls ink from a page. Change that shirt for a fresh one each morning, and you had, in the understanding of the era, actually removed a genuine layer of bodily dirt, transferred bodily and completely onto cloth that could then be properly laundered, while the outer garments, the wool doublets, the velvet gowns, the fur-trimmed sleeves that never touched skin directly and were never meant to be washed at all, simply carried on looking presentable indefinitely. The visible whiteness of a man's collar and cuffs at court was not decoration. It was evidence, displayed quite deliberately at the exact points where linen showed past the edge of the outer clothing, that the body underneath had been properly attended to that very morning. This is why the laundering of household linen occupied so much labor and so much household planning, considerably more than modern laundry occupies in most homes today. Washing linen properly, what the era called bucking, involved layering the cloth in a large tub with wood ash and stale urine, both natural sources of the alkaline compounds needed to lift grease and body soil from fabric. Pouring hot water through the layers repeatedly over the course of a full day, and then laying the washed linen out across hedges or spread grass in direct sunlight, which bleached it whiter through a combination of drying and mild sun exposure that no dye of the period could ever quite replicate artificially. A great household like the one William served kept laundresses employed nearly full-time managing this cycle, since a gentleman expected to appear in fresh linen daily needed a genuine rotation of shirts, sometimes a dozen or more, for a single well-off man, moving constantly between his back, the laundry tub, the drying hedge, and the linen chest. Alice, William's wife, managed exactly this rotation for their own household, and it occupied a meaningful share of her daily attention, more than William himself ever fully appreciated. She kept a running count of shirts in various states, clean and folded in the chest, worn and waiting for the wash, soaking, drying, being pressed smooth with a heated iron before being folded again, and she knew, in a way William did not, precisely how close their household ever came to running short of clean linen during a busy stretch at court. A genuine anxiety for any household whose reputation depended on a husband appearing daily in white that could bear close inspection. William, for his part, cared about the result rather than the labor behind it, and he was, by his own quiet admission, more vain about his linen than about almost anything else he wore. He had learned, the way every courtier learned, to notice at a glance whose collar had gone slightly grey at the edge, whose cuff showed the faint yellow of a shirt worn one day past its welcome, and he took real private satisfaction in knowing his own linen never gave anyone at court that particular thing to notice about him. His own visible linen that year amounted to a plain standing collar and a pair of narrow cuffs, modest by the standards of the elaborate ruffs a later Tudor court would eventually favour, but no less carefully watched for all that, since a plain collar left even less room to hide a day-old shirt than a more elaborate one might have offered. Fresh straight from the wash, William's linen carried a smell of its own, faintly sharp from the lye and the sun, and he associated that particular smell so completely with the idea of being properly presented that its absence, on the rare morning a shirt came back from Alice's laundress's less than perfectly fresh, left him faintly unsettled in a way he could never quite have explained to anyone who asked him why. The broader picture beyond William's own household is considerably starker, and it maps almost exactly onto wealth. A prosperous merchant or minor gentleman might own 6 or 8 shirts and change daily without strain. A great lord might own dozens, laundered by a staff large enough that the rotation never came under pressure at all. A labouring family, by contrast, often owned 1 shirt per person, sometimes 2, worn for days or even weeks between washes, simply because there was no spare garment to change into while the first one was being laundered, and because the labour and fuel that bucking required was itself a real expense a poor household could not always spare. The social historian Liza Picard has written about exactly this gap, noting that the number of shirts a person owned functioned, in practice, as a far more accurate measure of their actual cleanliness than anything to do with bathing, since a wealthy man who never fully submerged in water for months could still present himself as scrupulously, visibly clean simply by having enough linen to change constantly, while a poor man washing at the same river every week might still smell strongly for want of a second shirt to change into while the first dried. Cleanliness, in other words, had quietly become a matter of laundry capacity rather than water at all. And laundry capacity, like nearly everything else in Tudor England, was a direct function of money. There is something clarifying about understanding cleanliness this way, as a resource distributed by wealth rather than a habit distributed by virtue. William was not more disciplined than the stable boy who mucked out the royal horses each morning in the same shirt he had worn 3 days running. William simply had a wife managing a linen chest large enough, and laundresses paid well enough, that the gap between one clean shirt and the next never had to be felt. The whiteness at his collar told the court he was clean. What it actually told them, if anyone had cared to read it correctly, was that he was rich. The sweating sickness first appeared in England in 1485, in the weeks around Henry Tudor's arrival to claim the crown at Bosworth, and by the time it finally vanished from the historical record in 1551, it had returned in 5 separate epidemics, in 1485, 1508, 1517, 1528, and that final outbreak in 1551, each one arriving without warning and each one leaving behind a country too frightened to fully exhale until it had passed. If you assume the era's great medical terror was the plague, the black swellings and dark blood everyone still associates with medieval disease, you are picturing the wrong illness for this particular summer. Plague was familiar by 1528, understood in its rough outlines even if not its cause. Feared, but at least recognizable. The sweat was something else entirely, a disease English physicians could not explain, could not reliably treat, and could not even fully describe to visitors from the continent, because for reasons nobody at the time understood and nobody has fully explained since, it barely touched anywhere outside England, and the pockets of Europe England's own trade and travel carried it toward. What made the sweat so uniquely terrifying was not its lethality alone, severe as that was, but its speed. A person could wake feeling entirely well, be seized within hours by a sudden overwhelming sense of dread, then chills, then a headache and an aching in the limbs severe enough to make walking difficult, and then, often within that same day, break into a drenching, uncontrollable sweat that soaked through clothing and bedding alike. From there, the outcome frequently resolved itself within 24 hours, one direction or the other. Either the fever broke and the sufferer began a slow recovery, or the heart itself seemed to give out, and the person was dead before a physician summoned that same morning could do anything more than watch. Contemporary accounts describe entire households struck within a single night. A man dining in perfect health and dead before the following dusk, and the randomness of it, striking the young and vigorous as readily as the old and frail, made it feel less like an illness and more like a judgment with no visible logic behind who it chose. A French ambassador residing in London that summer, writing home in June of 1528 as the sickness tore through the city, put the era's fear into a single sentence that survives in the diplomatic correspondence of the period. "This disease," he wrote, "is the easiest in the world to die of." He meant it almost literally. Nothing about the illness gave a person time to prepare, to send for a priest with any confidence they would live to see him arrive, or to make arrangements for a household that might, by the following evening, no longer include them. Physicians of the era, working from the same humoral framework that shaped every other belief this hour has already walked through, understood the sweat as a violent expulsion of corrupted matter from the body, the humors trying desperately to purge themselves of poison the sufferer had absorbed, most likely, in their understanding, through the very air surrounding them. The prescribed treatment involved keeping the patient warm, sometimes dangerously so, wrapped tightly in blankets to encourage the sweat to run its full course, on the theory that stopping it partway would trap the corrupted matter inside the body rather than letting it escape. Physicians of the period noted, with real alarm, that patients who could not bear the heat of their own wrappings and threw off their blankets partway through the illness frequently died within the hour. A pattern that only reinforced the belief that the sweat had to be allowed to run its complete course under warmth, however unbearable, rather than cooled or interrupted at any stage. The physician John Caius, who would go on to survive the disease's final appearance in 1551 and write the fullest surviving account of it, a work titled A Boke or Counsel Against the Disease Commonly Called the Sweat, described the same terrifying progression William's court was already living through in 1528. A sudden onset, a violent sweat, and an outcome decided. One direction or the other, well, within a single day. No figure in England took the threat of the sweat more seriously, or reacted to it more visibly, than the king himself. Henry VIII had a documented, near-obsessive dread of illness that historians have traced across his entire reign. A fear sharpened by childhood losses in his own family and by a genuine, well-founded understanding of how vulnerable even a king's body remained against a disease nobody could explain. In the summer of 1528, as the sweat moved through London and the surrounding counties with particular ferocity, Henry did exactly what he had done during previous outbreaks, and would do again. He broke up his own court, scattering his household across smaller hunting lodges and country houses to avoid concentrating potential infection in one place, and he moved constantly himself, sometimes changing his lodging and his very bed from one night to the next, on the belief that a location once touched by the sickness remained dangerous even after the immediate danger had apparently passed. He wrote anxious letters that summer, checking on the health of those closest to him, and among the people he worried over most was Anne Boleyn, the woman he was actively working to make his second wife, who caught the sweat herself that same season at Hever, along with her father, while her sister-in-law died of it in the same household. Henry's own letters from that period, still read by historians today, show a man genuinely terrified, praying for her recovery and keeping his own distance from Hever even as he begged for news. exactly the behavior the medical thinking of the age demanded of anyone hoping to survive a summer like this one. For William, the fear arrived less through royal correspondence and more through the ordinary channel of court gossip and dread, which travelled the corridors of the household faster than any official proclamation. The groom whose death opened William's mourning that day was, within a week, one name among several circulating quietly through the privy chamber, servants and gentlemen alike. Each new case discussed in the careful, lowered voices people use when they are afraid but do not want to be seen as afraid in front of their social equals. William found himself doing what nearly everyone at court that summer was doing, without quite admitting it, watching his own body constantly for the first hint of dread or chill that supposedly announced the sickness, testing his own pulse at odd moments, noticing every ordinary ache with a heightened, anxious attention it would never have received in an ordinary year. He slept badly. He avoided crowded halls where he could manage it, though a gentleman of the privy chamber had limited ability to simply absent himself from court entirely. And when the king's own household began making preparations to move to a smaller, more isolated house further from London, William felt something close to relief mixed with a fresh, sharper fear, since a move like that one confirmed, more clearly than any rumour could, just how seriously the danger was being taken by the one person in England with the resources to actually run from it. The broader historical picture makes William's fear look entirely reasonable rather than excessive. Modern researchers, working from the surviving descriptions of symptoms and progression, still cannot agree with total confidence on what the sweating sickness actually was in modern medical terms, though a hantavirus, a pathogen carried by rodents and transmitted through contaminated dust or waste, remains among the leading theories precisely because it would explain the disease's confinement largely to England and its sudden, unexplained disappearance after 1551, once whatever animal population carried it had shifted or declined. What is not in dispute is the mortality. Entire wealthy households lost multiple members within days during the worst outbreaks, and the disease showed a documented tendency to strike hardest among the young, healthy, and prosperous, the exact population that felt itself, in every other respect, protected by money and position. This detail alone helps explain why the era's medical anxieties, the fear of bad air, the caution around open pores, the entire architecture of dry washing and careful bathing this hour has already described, carried the emotional weight they carried. These were not abstract theories debated by physicians with nothing better to worry about. They were the only tools anyone had against a disease that could kill a healthy young courtier between breakfast and supper. And in a summer like 1528, every single one of those tools got used with real, unhesitating seriousness by everyone who could afford to use them. There is a quiet observation worth carrying forward from this chapter into everything that follows. The fear of water that shaped William's entire relationship with his own body did not exist in a vacuum, some quaint misunderstanding a modern viewer can comfortably feel superior to. It existed inside a summer where people really were dying, fast and without warning, and where the only available protection was a set of beliefs about air, skin, and cleanliness that felt, to everyone holding them, like the difference between living and not, understanding that fear does not require agreeing with the medicine behind it. It only requires remembering what it actually felt like to be a body in 1528, uncertain whether the next ordinary morning would be the one that turned. Which brings us to the question sitting underneath every precaution this hour has already described. The question nobody at William's court would have needed to ask out loud, because everyone already assumed they knew the answer. What, exactly, did people in 1528 believe was actually causing disease in the first place? Ask a modern listener to guess, and most will reach, correctly, for the idea of bad air. Some vague sense that Tudor people blamed smells for sickness in a way that sounds almost charming from a distance. A quaint misunderstanding, easily corrected by a single lesson in microbiology. What that guess usually misses is how completely this belief structured daily life, how seriously it was held by the most educated men in England, and how directly it explains nearly every practice this hour has already walked through, from the empty tub to the dry linen cloth to the fresh shirt each morning. The actual belief, which historians call miasma theory, held that disease travelled through the air itself in the form of corrupted vapour rising from anything that rotted or stagnated, standing water, unburied waste, crowded churchyards, decaying matter of any kind, and that a person who breathed this vapour in, or who allowed it to enter the body through an open pore, absorbed the sickness carried within it. The theory was not a piece of folk superstition dreamed up by uneducated villagers. It descended directly from the Hippocratic and Galenic medical tradition that every university-trained physician in England had studied. The same body of thought governing the four humours and the danger of hot water this hour has already covered, and it had, by 1528, roughly 2,000 years of continuous scholarly authority behind it. A physician recommending that his patient avoid the air near a churchyard or a stagnant ditch was not guessing. He was applying a theory of disease transmission that represented the genuine cutting edge of European medical thought, unchallenged by any rival explanation with comparable evidence behind it, because the actual mechanism of infectious disease, invisible microorganisms passing from person to person or surface to surface, would not be proposed with any real scientific backing for another 300 years. Miasma theory shaped nearly every visible precaution a wealthy Tudor household took against illness. Windows were kept shut at night in the belief that night air itself, cooler and heavier, carried a particular concentration of corrupted vapour that daylight and sun somehow burned away or dispersed. Physicians recommended that anyone able to leave a city during an outbreak do exactly that, since crowded streets, open sewers, and the general density of urban waste were understood to generate miasma at a rate the countryside simply did not match. Which is precisely why Henry's own instinct that summer, breaking up his court and scattering it across smaller country houses, followed textbook medical logic rather than mere royal panic. Sweet-smelling substances, herbs, spices, burning wood, scented water were valued not only for pleasure but as active defences, since a foul smell was itself considered a direct signal of miasma present in the air, and a pleasant smell was believed, by extension, to counter or displace it. This is the same logic, seen from a different angle, that made the hot bath so frightening during an epidemic summer. If disease travelled on foul air and entered through open pores, then a hot bath during a season when the sweat was moving through the country combined the single most dangerous condition of the body, an open pore, with the single most dangerous condition of the surrounding air, a summer thick with the corrupted vapour everyone believed was actively killing people within the same week. William managed his own daily exposure to this invisible danger with a set of small, constant habits so automatic to him that he rarely thought of them as precautions at all, simply as sense. He avoided walking too near the common ditches and privies that ran behind the palace kitchens whenever another route was available, and on the rare occasions his path took him past a churchyard, particularly one that had received fresh burials that week, he found himself, without quite deciding to, holding his breath or turning his face slightly away. The way a modern person might flinch from something they knew intellectually could not actually harm them but still felt compelled to avoid. He kept a small square of linen, scented with cloves and a little vinegar, tucked in his sleeve that summer, more diligently than in an ordinary year, and he pressed it briefly to his nose whenever he crossed a particularly close or crowded stretch of corridor, a habit half genuine precaution and half simple comfort, the kind of small ritual a frightened person performs because doing something, anything, feels considerably better than doing nothing at all. At night, regardless of the summer heat pressing against the walls of his chamber, William kept his window latched, trusting the stuffiness of a closed room over whatever the open night air outside might be carrying. None of this struck William, or anyone around him, as excessive or superstitious. It struck him as ordinary prudence, the same category of behaviour a modern person places on washing their hands before a meal or avoiding a visibly sick co-worker's coughing, an unremarkable precaution taken so automatically that explaining the reasoning behind it would have felt almost strange. The way explaining why you look both directions before crossing a street would feel strange today. The historian Keith Thomas, writing about the broader landscape of Tudor and early modern belief, has described just how thoroughly explanations like miasma theory functioned as genuine, coherent knowledge for the people holding them. Not a placeholder awaiting correction, but a complete working model of how the world operated, tested against experience and refined by generations of careful observation, however wrong its underlying premise would eventually prove to be. A Tudor physician was not failing to notice germs the way a careless student fails to notice an obvious answer on an examination. He was working entirely without the instrument, the microscope capable of real biological magnification, that would eventually make germs visible at all, and reasoning quite skillfully from every piece of evidence actually available to him. There is a quiet observation worth sitting with before this hour moves further into the specific defences this belief produced, the pomanders and the strewn herbs and the perfumed household William relied on daily. Miasma theory was not a mistake made by fools. It was a coherent, carefully reasoned explanation of the world, built by serious minds working with the best tools their century possessed, and it happened to be wrong in a way that would take 3 more centuries of scientific advancement to fully correct. William closed his window each night not from ignorance, but from the same impulse that closes a modern window against a thunderstorm. The reasonable, careful management of a danger he could not see, but had every reason to believe was real. For William, all of this reasoning about pores and vapor and open skin was theory applied to an ordinary body, his own. For the king, the same theory was applied to the single most protected body in England, and watching how that protection actually worked, from as close as William's position occasionally allowed him to stand, reveals something the opening image of this hour only partly captured. If you assume that a king, of all people, must surely have bathed properly and often, simply because he could afford anything money could buy, you are assuming money solved a problem that Tudor medicine did not believe money could touch. Henry's wealth did not make bathing safe. It only made his rare baths considerably more elaborate than anyone else's. The actual arrangement Henry maintained for bathing was, by the standards of the age, an engineering achievement in its own right. And the surviving evidence for it comes from one of the best documented royal bathrooms in English history. The year after the worst of the 1528 outbreak had passed, in 1529, Henry had a bathroom built into the Bain Tower at Hampton Court. A purpose-built chamber on the first floor supplied by its own system of pipes, one delivering hot water and one delivering cold. Fed from a charcoal-fired boiler in an adjoining room that was itself kept filled from a cistern connected to a conduit bringing fresh spring water into the palace from a source some 3 miles distant. The tub itself, made by a cooper to the king's own specifications, sat inside a room with a ceiling worked in gilt, battens against a white ground, deep window seats built into the walls, and cupboards for the linens, herbs, and implements the ritual required. Similar installations existed at the Tower of London, at Windsor, and later at Whitehall, where Henry would eventually install an even more elaborate version in the following decade, and taken together they represent some of the most sophisticated domestic plumbing anywhere in 16th century Europe, built for a man who used them only a handful of times a year. Keeping such a system ready required its own quiet labor force, largely invisible in every account that survives of the king actually bathing. Someone had to keep the charcoal boiler fed and burning for hours before the water reached a usable temperature. Someone had to draw fresh water from the conduit and manage the cistern feeding the pipes. And someone had to clean and dry the tub thoroughly after each use, since a damp, standing tub was itself considered a small source of the corrupted air everyone in that household spent so much effort avoiding. Architectural historians examining the Hampton Court accounts have noted that maintaining the Bain Tower system probably occupied several servants across a full day for every single occasion the king actually chose to bathe. a considerable expenditure of labour and fuel for an event that might last less than an hour once the water was finally ready. No comparable arrangement existed at most European courts of the period, where piped hot water on this scale remained rare even among monarchs, which makes Henry's bathroom less a sign of ordinary royal luxury and more a genuine engineering outlier. A solution built specifically because the problem it solved, making an already feared activity as safe and as comfortable as human ingenuity could. Manage was considered worth an extraordinary amount of royal expense. The elaborateness of the installation was not indulgence for its own sake. It was precaution, engineered at royal expense. Every element of the Bain Tower bathroom existed to manage the specific dangers Tudor medicine associated with hot water. Rather than to make bathing more frequent or more casual, the water's temperature was monitored and adjusted with real care before the king ever stepped in, using the two separate taps to blend hot and cold to a precise moderate warmth rather than the scalding heat a modern spa visitor might expect. Since excessive heat was believed to force the pores open more violently and invite correspondingly greater danger. Sweet herbs, the same rosemary, chamomile, and marjoram this hour has already described floating on the surface of the king's bath in its opening image, were steeped directly into the water specifically to counter miasma, since a fragrant bath was understood to actively fight off corrupted air even while the water itself performed its more dangerous work of opening the skin. Afterward, the king was wrapped immediately in warmed linen and allowed to rest, sometimes for a considerable stretch, while his body's disturbed humours were given time to settle back into balance. Precisely the same aftercare Dr. Griffith prescribed for William on a far smaller scale, only performed here with the full resources of the royal household behind it. William witnessed this ritual only twice in his 4 years at court, both times as one of several gentlemen assisting with the king's dressing immediately afterward, and both experiences left him with a clearer sense of just how different his own relationship with water was from the king's, despite their sharing the identical underlying fear. Where William's dry washing happened briskly, almost automatically, each morning, the king's bath happened as a genuine event, planned in advance, attended by a physician, surrounded by an entire supporting staff whose sole purpose that day was managing the danger of the water rather than simply providing it. William remembered the strange quiet in the room both times, servants moving carefully and speaking in low voices, the physician watching the king's colour and breathing with real attention throughout, and the noticeably slower pace of everything that followed, the king resting wrapped in linen for the better part of an hour while the household around him effectively paused to let the danger pass. It struck William, standing at the edge of that room, that the king's wealth had bought him something considerably stranger than comfort. It had bought him the ability to take a genuine risk, carefully managed and fully staffed, that William himself would never have dared attempt without exactly that same level of support. The broader context here matters because it corrects a natural but mistaken assumption, the idea that royal bathing facilities like the Bain Tower prove the fear of water was really just a poor man's superstition that wealth and good plumbing could simply engineer around. The opposite is closer to the truth. The very existence of such an elaborate, heavily monitored bathing chamber shows how seriously even the most protected man in England took the danger. Since nobody builds a dedicated boiler, a physician's standing attendance, and a full aftercare regimen around an activity they consider entirely safe. Historians examining the Hampton Court accounts, among them Simon Thurley, who has written extensively on the architectural history of Henry's palaces, have noted that the bathroom's sophistication reflects an anxious rather than a casual relationship with water, precaution built directly into stone and pipework because the danger it managed was considered entirely real. Henry did not bathe more often than William because he was less afraid. He bathed exactly as rarely and simply had the resources to make each individual instance considerably safer and considerably more comfortable than anything available to a gentleman of modest means. There is something worth carrying forward from the sight of that quiet, careful room at Hampton Court. water steaming gently while an entire household holds its breath around it. The king's bath was not proof that money erased the era's fears about water. It was proof of how deeply those fears ran, visible in exactly the place you would expect wealth to have overridden them if wealth had ever actually been the obstacle in the first place. There was one form of public bathing available in England during William's lifetime, and it is worth pausing on precisely because it shows what happened to communal water once disease and reputation attached themselves to it at the same time. Across the river from the City of London, in the district of Southwark, sat a cluster of establishments Londoners called the Stews, a name descended from the old word for a heated bathing room, and for generations before William's birth they had offered exactly what the name promised: steam and hot water for hire, a public bathhouse trade with roots stretching back through the medieval period. If you picture these places as simple, honest bathhouses that a busy Tudor city might reasonably have supported, you are picturing the institution's original purpose accurately enough. By the early 16th century, that purpose had become thoroughly entangled with a second trade conducted under the same roofs, and the entanglement would eventually prove fatal to the whole enterprise. The Stews of Southwark had operated for so long as licensed brothels alongside their bathing function that the two identities were, by William's time, functionally inseparable in the public mind, and this mattered enormously once a new disease arrived in Europe that nobody in England had a name for a generation earlier. Syphilis appeared on the continent in the final years of the 15th century, spreading with terrifying speed through populations that had no prior exposure and no inherited resistance, and it reached England within William's grandparents' lifetime, carried, as contemporaries understood it, through exactly the kind of close physical contact the Southwark trade specialized in. Henry VII, Henry's own father, had already grown alarmed enough by the connection to order the Stews closed once, in 1504, only to see the trade quietly reopen within the year once the immediate panic passed. Since Southwark sat conveniently outside the City of London's own legal jurisdiction, and the business proved simply too profitable and too entrenched to suppress with a single proclamation. By 1528, the reputation of the Stews as a place where a man risked considerably more than his purse was already common knowledge at William's court, discussed with the same careful, half-joking unease people use for any danger they consider real, but slightly embarrassing to admit taking seriously. William had never gone there himself. Not from any particular virtue on his part, but because a gentleman of the Privy Chamber, with a wife managing his household and a reputation to protect at court, had every reason to avoid a place that could cost him considerably more than money. And he had heard enough warnings from older, more experienced courtiers, delivered in the tone of men passing down information they clearly believed useful, to take the danger at face value. The pox, as Englishmen of the period generally called it, produced visible, disfiguring symptoms that no amount of powder or perfume could fully disguise once they set in. And a court built entirely around visible surface, correct linen, unblemished skin, a face fit to be presented before the king, had every reason to treat a disease that ruined the face as something considerably more frightening than an ordinary fever. The Stews themselves had once operated under a surprisingly formal set of civic regulations, dating back to ordinances issued in the previous century, which specified matters such as the days women employed there were permitted to work and required regular inspection for signs of illness. A system of licensed oversight that had, by William's own lifetime, plainly failed to contain the disease it was meant to manage. Southwark's continued operation under the Bishop of Winchester's own jurisdiction, rather than the City of London's stricter governance, added a further layer of irony that William's more cynical fellow courtiers occasionally remarked on. The trade having survived for generations under a form of ecclesiastical oversight that regulated its conduct without ever seriously threatening its existence, right up until the disease it had failed to contain finally made that existence impossible to defend. The broader trajectory of the stews, which extends well past the summer this hour is otherwise centered on, shows exactly how completely disease anxiety could reshape a piece of everyday urban infrastructure once it became associated with contagion. 18 years after this particular summer, in April of 1546, Henry himself issued the proclamation that finally closed the Southwark stews for good, citing the spread of the pox explicitly among his reasons. A closure that held where his father's earlier attempt had not, in part because the association between the stews and syphilis had only hardened further in the intervening decades. The closure did not end prostitution in London, which historians studying the period have shown simply dispersed more widely across the city's streets and taverns once its licensed home was shut down. But it did mark the effective end of public communal bathing as an institution in England for a very long time afterward. Once a bathhouse became inseparable, in the public imagination, from a fatal and disfiguring disease, no amount of steam or hot water could fully wash that association back out of it, and Southwark's trade never returned to anything resembling its old, semi-respectable footing. There is a quiet observation worth carrying out of Southwark and back into William's own more private world of dry linen and careful physicians. The instinct that closed the stews, the fear that shared water and close contact between bodies could carry a specific, nameable danger from one person to the next, ran directly parallel to the instinct keeping William's own tub empty upstairs at court. Even though the two fears attached themselves to different diseases and different mechanisms in the era's own understanding, public bathing and private bathing were, in this sense, casualties of the same broader anxiety, one closed by royal proclamation and the other simply left standing unused in the corner of a gentleman's chamber, and both outcomes came from the same underlying conviction that the body, however clean it looked on the surface, was never entirely safe from what touched it. Close your eyes for a moment and consider what William actually put in his mouth each morning to keep his teeth presentable at court. Because the answer sits at an odd angle to almost everything modern dentistry has trained us to expect. If you imagine Tudor dental care at all, you probably imagine its absence. Rotting teeth blackened by an era with no concept of oral hygiene. A mouth left to whatever damage time and diet inflicted on it. The truth is stranger than either the modern assumption of neglect or the comfortable myth of natural good fortune. Tudor gentlemen and gentlewomen cleaned their teeth quite deliberately, with real attention and real daily ritual, using methods that were often, in a quietly unfortunate irony, working against them the entire time. The standard tool was not a brush in anything like the modern sense, since the bristled toothbrush would not become a common English household object for another century or more. Instead, cleaning happened by rubbing the teeth directly with a piece of cloth, sometimes wrapped around a finger, sometimes fixed to a small stick, dipped into a dry powder kept specifically for the purpose. The powders themselves varied by what a household could afford, and what a local apothecary or physician recommended. Wealthier households favoured powdered pumice stone or crushed cuttlefish bone, both effective enough at lifting surface stain, mixed sometimes with a little chalk or ground coral for a whitening effect that Tudor gentlemen and gentlewomen valued every bit as much as a modern person values a bright smile. Recipes from the period also call for crushed brick dust and ground pottery fragments, abrasive enough to scour away discoloration in a single vigorous session, and a poorer household without access to pumice or cuttlefish might rely on plain soot or ash, considerably cheaper and considerably harsher on the tooth underneath it. The bitter irony running underneath every one of these methods, confirmed by modern dental historians examining surviving Tudor skeletal remains, is that the very abrasiveness making these powders effective at removing stain also wore steadily at the enamel protecting the tooth itself, so that the cleaner a fashionable mouth looked on a given morning, the more quietly vulnerable its teeth were becoming underneath that polish. Alongside the powder, a Tudor household of William's standing kept a mouthwash on hand, typically a mixture of white wine or vinegar steeped with fragrant herbs, swilled around the mouth after the powder had done its scouring work, prized both for the fresh taste it left behind and for a genuine, if partial, antiseptic effect the acidity of the wine or vinegar actually produced against the bacteria living in the mouth. Even though nobody at the time understood bacteria to be the thing being fought. Cloves, aniseed, and other fragrant seeds were chewed between meals to sweeten the breath further. A habit that shaded naturally into the era's broader obsession with countering foul smell wherever it appeared on the body, since bad breath, like any other unpleasant odor, carried the same faint whiff of miasma this hour has already spent considerable time describing. William performed this entire routine each morning with a briskness that had, like the dry washing before it, become almost automatic. Robert preparing the small dish of powdered cuttlefish and pumice, while William rinsed his mouth first with the herbal wine kept for the purpose, working the powder across his teeth with a folded linen cloth for a count of perhaps 30 strokes before rinsing again and finishing with a clove tucked briefly against his cheek before he ever presented himself at court. William was, if pressed to admit it, rather more careful about his breath than about almost any other part of his daily grooming, since a gentleman standing close enough to the king to murmur a private word during a council or a meal had every practical reason to guard against the embarrassment of foul breath reaching a royal ear. And he had watched more than one courtier's reputation take a quiet, permanent dent from exactly that kind of small, unfortunate lapse. He did not know, and had no way of knowing, that the very diligence making his smile presentable that morning was steadily thinning the enamel that protected it. A slow trade he was making without ever being told the terms. The broader picture here complicates the tidy modern assumption in a useful direction. Studies of Tudor and earlier medieval skeletal remains, cited by researchers examining England's dental history across the period, have consistently found rates of tooth decay considerably lower than those recorded in later centuries, a fact that surprises most people encountering it for the first time. The explanation has less to do with any superior method of cleaning and more to do with diet. Refined cane sugar remained a rare, expensive luxury in the England of 1528, imported in small quantities and reserved almost entirely for the wealthiest tables, which meant that even William's relatively privileged mouth encountered far less of the sugar that drives tooth decay in a modern diet than an ordinary person's mouth encounters today without any particular effort at all. That advantage would not last. Within William's own lifetime, as English trade routes expanded and sugar grew steadily cheaper and more available at court, later Tudor figures would begin showing the blackened, decayed teeth that later generations mistakenly assumed defined the whole era from the start. Elizabeth herself becoming a famous example decades later of exactly what a lifetime of increasingly available sugar could do to a mouth that had once belonged to a considerably more fortunate dietary age. There is something worth pausing on in the picture of William each morning, cloth and powder in hand, working carefully at a mouth he genuinely believed he was protecting. He was not neglecting his teeth. If anything, he was tending them with more deliberate daily attention than most people give their own teeth today, and the fact that his careful ritual was quietly working against him does not make his diligence any less real. He believed, correctly by the standards of his century, that he was doing everything a sensible gentleman could do, and in a narrow, practical sense, for one more generation at least, before sugar changed the arithmetic entirely, he was mostly right. The smell alone would tell you something was different about this court, if you could somehow stand inside it for even a single afternoon. Beneath the wool and unwashed linen this hour has already described in some detail sat a second, deliberate layer of scent, applied constantly and with real purpose, and understanding what that scent was actually for corrects one of the most persistent modern assumptions about Tudor perfume. If you imagine the era's obsession with sweet smells as pure vanity, a fashionable indulgence with no practical function beyond covering up an unwashed body, you are missing the fact that, to the people wearing it, perfume was medicine every bit as much as it was decoration. The two purposes were not separate ideas competing for the same bottle. They were the same idea, worn at the belt or burned in a dish, because a pleasant smell was believed to actively fight the very air that was thought to carry disease. The pomander sat at the center of this system, a small hollow case, often silver or gold for those who could afford it, carved with pierced openings and packed with a fragrant paste of ambergris, musk, civet, ground cloves, and other aromatic ingredients, worn on a chain around the neck or hung from the belt where a hand could reach it quickly. The name itself descends from the French pomme d'ambre, apple of amber, a reference to the ambergris that gave the finest examples their base scent. And a Tudor gentleman or gentlewoman raised the pomander to the nose, specifically at the moments miasma theory identified as most dangerous, passing through a crowded street, crossing near an open sewer or a churchyard, entering a sick room, or simply moving through any space where the surrounding air felt close, stale, or foul. Cardinal Wolsey, Henry's own chief minister, and by 1528 still the most powerful man in England after the king himself, was famously documented carrying a hollowed orange stuffed with a vinegar-soaked sponge and a mixture of spices whenever he moved through crowded halls or sat in judgment over petitioners, precisely because a room full of ordinary Londoners, packed close together in the summer heat, represented exactly the kind of thick, corrupted air his own physicians warned him against. He would lift the orange to his face at intervals throughout an audience, a gesture every person watching him understood immediately and without any need for explanation. Strewing herbs across the floor served the identical purpose at a household scale rather than a personal one. Rush matting, the loose plant material spread across floors in place of the fitted carpets and floorboards a modern home would use, was mixed through with dried lavender, meadowsweet, chamomile and other fragrant herbs, replaced regularly and crushed underfoot throughout the day, releasing their scent continuously into a room's air and, in the understanding of the period, actively working against whatever corrupted vapour might otherwise settle there. Later Tudor household manuals, among them Thomas Tusser's widely read Guide to Household Management, first printed in the 1550s, list specific herbs recommended for exactly this purpose. Meadowsweet valued in particular for a scent contemporaries described as sweeter than almost anything else available, and the practice these later manuals codified in print had already been standard household management for generations by the time William's own servants were laying fresh rushes down each week at Kent. Elizabeth of York, grandmother to the young Princess Mary and mother to Henry himself, had kept detailed household accounts recording payments to gatherers who brought sweet herbs and flowers into the royal apartments decades before this particular summer. Evidence that this same fragrant defense had already been running, quietly and continuously, across 2 full generations of the same royal family by the time William's own servants took up the identical task at Kent. The scent of a great Tudor house, in other words, was not a passing fashion of any single decade. It was a defense maintained continuously, household after household, for as long as anyone at court could actually remember, refreshed weekly with the same unhurried reliability as a modern household restocking its own cleaning supplies. William's own household kept both defences running constantly that summer with a diligence considerably greater than in an ordinary year. His pomander was modest by Wolsey's standards, a plain silver case rather than gold, filled with a paste his own apothecary mixed from cloves, dried rosemary, and a little civet, refreshed every few weeks as the scent faded, and he had taken to carrying it more consistently than he ever had before, reaching for it almost without thinking whenever his morning duties took him through the more crowded corridors of the palace or past the kitchens where the day's refuse collected before being carted away. His wife Alice had the household rushes changed weekly rather than the household's usual monthly rhythm, mixing in extra lavender and meadowsweet bought at real expense from a local herb seller who reported, that particular summer, selling out of his stock faster than he could restock it, since William's household was hardly alone in reaching for every available defense. William's own chamber, by midsummer, carried a thick, constant perfume of clove and crushed herb that a modern visitor might find almost overwhelming, and William himself found it comforting precisely because it smelled like protection, like a household actively fighting back against a danger it could not see. The broader picture surrounding this fragrant defense system reveals just how completely it was woven into the era's economy as well as its medicine. Ambergris and musk arrived in England through long, expensive trade routes stretching toward the Middle East and beyond. And a fine pomander filled with genuine ambergris could cost a sum that placed it well beyond a labouring family's reach, meaning that the wealthy quite literally purchased a superior defence against miasma the same way they purchased a superior defence against the danger of an unsupervised bath, through money applied directly to the era's own understanding of risk. A poorer household relied instead on whatever herbs grew locally and cost little. Rosemary and lavender rather than civet and ambergris, strewn more thinly and replaced less often, which meant that a poor household's heir, in the logic of the time, carried a genuinely thinner defence against the same danger threatening everyone equally. Wealth did not just buy comfort in Tudor England. It bought a materially better set of tools against a threat every single class of society took with complete seriousness. There is a quiet observation worth sitting with here, before this hour turns to the one place all of this careful, fragrant defence entirely failed to reach. The clove and rosemary hanging in the air of William's chamber that summer was not vanity dressed up as medicine. It was fear, made fragrant and portable, carried at the belt and strewn across the floor by people doing everything within their power and their understanding to protect themselves from a danger they could smell coming long before they could ever hope to see it. For William, all of the season's carefully managed fear, the empty tub, the dry linen, the pomander at his belt, the strewn herbs underfoot, converged most uncomfortably on a single part of his body that this hour has not yet mentioned directly, his own scalp. If the rest of Tudor hygiene amounted to an elaborate, reasoned system built around a wrong premise, the hair was where that system's actual failure became most literal, most itchy, and most completely unremarkable to everyone living inside it. The common assumption here runs in a predictable direction once a listener has absorbed everything this hour has already covered about bathing. Surely, you might think, if full immersion was considered dangerous, Tudor men and women at least washed their hair separately, using water in smaller, more controlled amounts the way you might rinse a cloth without submerging an entire body. The actual reality moves in almost the opposite direction. The head was considered, if anything, a more sensitive and more dangerous site for water than the rest of the body, since Tudor medicine held the head to be the seat of the most delicate humoral balance in the entire system, closely connected to the brain and to a person's essential temperament, and wetting it with hot water was thought to risk consequences ranging from headache and catarrh to far more serious derangements of health. Hair, as a result, was almost never washed with water at all among people of William's standing. It was brushed, vigorously and often, sometimes dressed with dry powders or a little oil to keep it lying smooth, and above all, it was combed, repeatedly and deliberately, with a fine-toothed comb whose purpose had nothing to do with styling and everything to do with removing what had accumulated there since the last combing. That purpose was lice, and it is worth being direct about just how universal a condition head lice actually were across Tudor society, cutting through every level of wealth with a thoroughness that money could not buy its way out of. Archaeological finds from the period include a striking number of fine-toothed combs, carved from boxwood or ivory for wealthier households and from cheaper wood for poorer ones, their teeth spaced tightly enough to catch both adult lice and the tiny eggs, called nits, that clung to individual strands of hair near the scalp. Living history researchers who have examined period diaries and household accounts have found lice treated as an entirely ordinary, almost boring fact of daily maintenance, nightly combing sessions recorded alongside prayers and meals rather than singled out as a source of particular shame, because nearly everyone at every table, from the scullery boy to the peer of the realm, was managing the identical low-grade infestation as a simple, unremarkable feature of having hair at all. Fleas presented a related but separate problem, thriving less in hair itself and more in the heavy wool clothing, fur trimmings, and straw-stuffed bedding that made up so much of Tudor material life. A fur-lined collar, or a fur-trimmed sleeve, prized for warmth and for the visible mark of status that good fur carried at court, made an excellent home for fleas, offering warmth, shelter and proximity to a blood meal all at once. And the heavier a household's textiles, the more thoroughly those textiles tended to host exactly the vermin their owners would have been horrified to name directly. Straw mattresses, changed only periodically and rarely washed in any meaningful sense, provided similar shelter at night, which meant that a Tudor bed, no matter how grand its hangings or how fine its linen sheets, generally came with an uninvited population of its own that nobody at the time considered worth mentioning any more than a modern person mentions the dust in their own home. William managed both conditions the way everyone around him managed them, without any real embarrassment attached, because there was nothing singular in his experience for embarrassment to attach itself to. Robert combed through William's hair most evenings with the fine-toothed comb kept specifically for the purpose, working section by section near the firelight while William sat patiently, occasionally wincing at a particularly stubborn nit worked free near the scalp, and the small, steady scratch of the comb's teeth against his skin had become, over years, an ordinary part of his evening the way brushing teeth is ordinary to a modern person, worth doing well, but never worth remarking on. His fur-trimmed collar, the very garment that told the court he was a gentleman of means, itched periodically in a way he had simply stopped noticing months earlier, and on the rare occasion he caught himself scratching at his own throat during a council meeting, he did so with the same unself-conscious ease with which a modern person might adjust an itchy sweater, because every single man standing near him in that same room was almost certainly managing an identical, unspoken itch of his own. Alice managed the same nightly ritual on her own longer hair, with considerably more patience required of her than of William, since a woman's hair, bound up under a hood for most of the day, offered lice a warmer and more sheltered environment to multiply in than a man's close-cropped style ever allowed his own scalp to become. She kept her own fine-toothed comb, a plainer one than William's, and worked through her hair each night by the same firelight, section by careful section, before it was rebound for sleep, a task she performed for herself, since no household in their modest circumstances kept a separate servant purely for a lady's hair. Neither of them thought of the other as somehow more or less afflicted for it. It was simply what a head of hair required, in a household, in a century that had never once considered water the answer to the question. The broader irony sitting underneath this entire chapter deserves to be stated plainly, because it reframes nearly everything this hour has already described. All of the elaborate, carefully reasoned precaution against miasma, the empty tub, the dry linen, the closed windows, the pomander raised against foul air, was built to fight an enemy that, as far as modern medical science can determine, was never actually the primary danger moving through William's world at all. The lice combed nightly from his hair, and the fleas riding quietly in his fur collar were real, biologically active organisms, capable then as now of carrying genuine disease from body to body and household to household, and the entire architecture of Tudor hygiene, however sophisticated its internal logic, did essentially nothing to slow them down, because nobody in 1528 had any reason to suspect that a tiny insect, rather than a foul smell, might be the thing worth actually fearing. The sweat that had emptied so many households that summer remains, even now, only partially understood by modern researchers, but the broader pattern of infectious disease across this period, plague chief among it, moved substantially through exactly the small, unremarked creatures riding in Tudor hair and Tudor fur, entirely unbothered by a defense system built with real intelligence and real seriousness against an invisible corrupted vapor that was never, in fact, the thing actually doing the killing. There is a quiet observation worth sitting with here, and it is perhaps the strangest one this hour has to offer. William spent that entire dangerous summer defending himself with real diligence against a danger that existed mostly in theory, while the danger that most plausibly did exist rode quietly against his own skin every single night, small enough to escape notice entirely. because it never once announced itself with a smell anyone had been trained to fear. Before we leave William's world for the reflections that close this hour, it is worth asking the one question a modern listener will already be forming without needing any prompting. Surely, once the fear of the sweat had passed and the summer of 1528 receded into memory, some clear-eyed physician somewhere corrected the whole system, restored the bath to its rightful place, and put this entire elaborate architecture of dry linen and pomanders quietly to rest within a generation or two. The actual reality is considerably less tidy and considerably more humbling for anyone tempted to feel superior to William's century from a comfortable distance. The beliefs governing his summer did not fade within his own lifetime, or his children's, or even his great-grandchildren's. They persisted, with only gradual modification, for well over 300 years. Miasma theory proved to be one of the longest-lived medical frameworks in European history, precisely because it was never definitively disproven so much as it was slowly, reluctantly outcompeted by a rival explanation that took centuries to fully assemble. Bathing habits among the English elite loosened only slightly across the Elizabethan and Stuart periods that followed William's own lifetime, and full immersion bathing remained a rare, carefully considered event rather than a daily habit well into the Georgian era, 200 years after this summer. Physicians continued recommending caution around hot water, continued warning against night air, and continued prescribing pomanders and strewn herbs against foul-smelling danger, because the underlying logic connecting bad air to disease had never actually been overturned by any single discovery. It had simply never yet met an explanation that fit the evidence better, and until one arrived, there was no good reason for a careful, rational person to abandon a system that had, after all, been refined and trusted by university-trained physicians for the better part of 2 millennia. Even the great houses of the following centuries, far grander and far wealthier than William's own modest Kent household, kept the same essential caution alive well past any point a modern observer might expect it to have faded. Palaces built generations after Hampton Court still treated a private bathroom as a rare luxury reserved for royalty rather than an ordinary fixture of daily life, and the dry rub of linen cloth this hour has already described in such detail persisted, in only slightly modified form, as the standard method of daily cleanliness for the English upper classes right up until the final decades before. Snow, Pasteur, and Lister between them finally rewrote the rules. A belief this deeply embedded, refined by that many generations of careful, sincere reasoning, does not simply evaporate the moment a better explanation exists somewhere in the world. It has to be proven, repeatedly, in a form ordinary people can actually see working, before 300 years of inherited caution can finally be allowed to loosen its grip. The first serious crack in that system did not arrive through a laboratory at all, but through a London physician tracing an outbreak street by street. In 1854, during a severe cholera epidemic in the Soho district of London, the physician John Snow mapped the individual cases of illness against the water sources residents actually used, and found the deaths clustering overwhelmingly around a single public water pump on Broad Street, a pattern that made no sense whatsoever under miasma theory, which predicted illness should track with foul air rather than with any particular water source. Snow's meticulous, almost forensic use of evidence, removing the pump handle and watching new cases fall away almost immediately afterward, did not by itself explain what was actually causing cholera, since the specific bacterium responsible would not be identified for years afterward. But it demonstrated something miasma theory could never account for, that a disease could travel through water itself rather than through the surrounding air, and that its spread could be traced, predicted, and interrupted using evidence rather than inherited theory alone. The full replacement of miasma theory came a little over a decade later, and came from an entirely different direction. In the 1860s, the French chemist Louis Pasteur demonstrated experimentally that specific microorganisms, rather than spontaneously generated corruption or airborne vapor, were responsible for fermentation and by clear extension for many forms of disease. work that laid the foundation for what would become known as germ theory. The British surgeon Joseph Lister took Pasteur's findings directly into the operating theatre beginning in 1867, introducing carbolic acid as an antiseptic specifically to kill the microorganisms Pasteur had identified rather than to counter foul air, and watched surgical infection rates fall dramatically as a direct result. A practical, undeniable demonstration that the germ explanation produced results the miasma explanation never had. Robert Koch's subsequent work identifying the specific bacteria responsible for individual diseases through the 1870s and 1880s completed what Snow had begun and Pasteur had proven. And by the final decades of the 19th century, the medical consensus that had shaped William's entire relationship with his own body in 1528 had finally, decisively given way. It had taken 330 years. William himself, of course, never lived to see any part of that reckoning, and neither did his children, nor in all likelihood his grandchildren. He would have gone to his own grave, whenever it eventually came for him, still believing precisely what Dr. Griffith had taught him as a young man, that hot water opened the pores, that foul air carried sickness, and that a clean shirt and a careful comb were the true instruments of a healthy, well-managed body. He would have raised his own children to keep the same careful distance from the tub, to trust the same pomander and the same strewn herbs, passing forward a system he had every reason to believe was simply correct. Because nothing in his own lifetime, or his father's or his grandfather's, had ever suggested otherwise. There is no failure in this. He was simply born on the near side of a discovery that would not arrive for centuries, doing the most careful, most reasoned version of health his own era had to offer him, exactly the way we are all, in our own turn, doing the most careful version available to us, waiting, without knowing it, for whatever correction our own descendants will eventually bring to something we currently consider settled and obvious. There is a final observation worth carrying out of William's century and into whatever remains of this hour. The tub sat empty in his chamber not because his century lacked intelligence or diligence or genuine care for the body, but because it lacked one specific tool, a way of actually seeing the thing that was truly making people sick. And in the absence of that tool, it built the most thorough, most carefully reasoned system it possibly could out of everything else available to it. Smell, symptom, inherited authority, and centuries of careful observation applied to a world that would not fully reveal its actual mechanisms for 300 more years. Everything this hour has described so far has moved largely through William's own body, but it would be a mistake to assume any of it belonged to men alone. If you picture the fear of water, the dry linen ritual, and the careful pomander as a specifically masculine set of concerns, tidy habits belonging to gentlemen at court, while the women around them managed their own bodies by some entirely different logic, you would be picturing a division that did not actually exist. Alice managed her own body, and every woman at that court managed hers, under precisely the same medical beliefs governing William's, adjusted only for the particular demands a woman's dress, hair, and household position placed on top of them. Alice's own mourning, which ran alongside William's in the same Kent household and later at court, began with the identical dry rub of linen cloth their maidservant performed with the same brisk, practiced hand Robert used on William, working across Alice's shoulders, back, and arms before she ever dressed. Her hair, worn long but kept bound and covered under a gable hood whenever she appeared in public, received the same treatment William's did, brushed and combed rather than washed, the fine-toothed comb doing its quiet nightly work against lice that showed no more regard for a lady's rank than for a groom's. Alice's linen smock served the same absorbent, cleansing function William's shirt served, changed daily when the household stock allowed it, and her own vanity attached itself to the same visible marker his did, the crisp, bright whiteness of a partlet or a cuff showing at the edge of her gown. evidence to anyone watching that the body beneath the wool and velvet had been properly attended to that morning. Where Alice's experience diverged from William's was mostly in scale and inconvenience rather than in kind. A full gown, heavier and more elaborately layered than a man's doublet and hose, trapped the day's heat and sweat more thoroughly against linen that had to work correspondingly harder. And a woman's hair, left uncut and often reaching well past the shoulder, gave lice considerably more territory to occupy than a man's close-cropped style ever offered them. A discomfort Alice managed with the same unbothered matter-of-factness William brought to his own itching collar. At the very top of that same court, the Queen herself lived under an identical set of restrictions, intensified by the particular scrutiny a queen's body always received. Catherine of Aragon, still Henry's wife in the summer of 1528, even as the king was already working quietly to end their marriage, maintained a household run by exactly the medical logic this hour has already described. Her own physicians as cautious about hot water and open pores as Dr. Griffith was with William. Her own ladies performing the identical dry washing and daily linen change. Her own strewn herbs and pomanders deployed against the same feared miasma moving through the country that summer. Catherine's household felt the sweat's danger with a particular sharpness that year, since the king's own physicians were, by every account, watching the health of the entire royal family with heightened, anxious attention, Princess Mary included, a child of 12 that summer, whose survival mattered enormously to a kingdom without a male heir, and whose every cough or complaint during an outbreak summer like this one would have been reported and fretted over at length. Anne Boleyn, whose own bout with the sweat that same season this hour has already mentioned, was one among several women in the king's immediate circle whose illness that summer tested the outer limits of every precaution the court could muster, since money, rank, and careful medical attention could slow the sweat's arrival not at all once it had actually taken hold in a household. The broader picture across the court's women deserves a moment of its own honest attention, because it corrects a lingering modern assumption that women somehow bore a heavier private burden of concealment than men did in this particular corner of Tudor life. In most respects, the burden was remarkably even. Both sexes dry-washed daily. Both sexes changed linen as often as their household's laundry capacity allowed, and both sexes judged each other's rank and discipline by the same visible whiteness at collar and cuff. Where the burden did tilt, it tilted toward the sheer physical labor underneath the surface, since a woman's household role generally included direct oversight of the very laundry cycle, keeping everyone presentable. Meaning that a wife like Alice carried both the private discomfort every courtier shared and the additional daily labor of making certain nobody in her household ever had to feel that discomfort visibly. It was a division of experience, in other words, not a division of taboo. The taboo itself, the fear of water, the trust in dry linen, the reliance on scent against invisible danger, belonged to the entire court equally, queen and gentleman usher alike. There is a quiet observation worth carrying forward from Alice's morning into whatever remains of this hour. The picture of a Tudor court divided neatly along the lines a modern viewer might expect. Women fussing over appearance while men managed graver matters of state and health simply does not hold up against the actual daily record. Every single person inside those walls, regardless of rank or sex, woke to the identical itch, reached for the identical cloth, and trusted the identical fragile theory of the body to see them safely through another dangerous summer, and in that respect at least, the Tudor court was a considerably more equal place than its portraits, painted almost exclusively of men in positions of visible power, will ever let you see. Step back now from William's particular summer, from the sweat and the pomanders and the fine-toothed comb, and a handful of larger truths begin to surface, the kind that only become visible once you have spent real time inside the small daily details rather than skimming past them toward a tidy conclusion. 4 patterns in particular run underneath everything this hour has described, and each one says something not only about 1528, but about the peculiar, universal work of managing a body inside whatever understanding of the world a person happens to be born into. The first pattern is this. What looks, from a distance, like neglect was in fact an extraordinary amount of careful, deliberate labor applied daily by people who took the health of their own bodies with complete seriousness. It would be easy, and it would be lazy, to look at William's empty bathtub and conclude that Tudor nobility simply could not be bothered with cleanliness, that the whole era shrugged at dirt the way a careless modern person might shrug at an unmade bed. Nothing in the actual record supports that reading. William's mornings were built around a demanding, multi-stage ritual: the dry rub of linen cloth, the careful selection of a fresh shirt, the tooth powder worked across his teeth with real attention, the pomander checked and refreshed, the rushes strewn and replaced on schedule. None of it was casual. All of it required real household labor, Robert's steady hands each morning, Alice's constant management of the linen chest, the household's growing herb bill that summer as the sweat drove everyone toward greater vigilance rather than less. The performance of health in Tudor England demanded real effort from real people every single day, and the fact that the effort was aimed, by modern understanding, at largely the wrong target does not make the effort itself any less genuine, or any less exhausting to sustain. The second pattern follows closely from the first. The body, in Tudor England, was never the thing everyone quietly agreed to pretend did not exist. If anything, the opposite is closer to true. The body was the single most discussed, most carefully managed subject running underneath the entire court's daily life that summer. Present in every conversation about the sweat, every physician's visit, every choice of shirt, every raised pomander in a crowded corridor. What the era agreed to manage discreetly was not the body's existence, but its vulnerability. The itch nobody mentioned, the shared discomfort nobody named directly, because naming it would have accomplished nothing except making an already anxious summer feel considerably more exposed. William's court did not ignore the body. It watched the body constantly, with the close, anxious attention of people who understood, correctly, that their bodies were the actual site where the summer's real danger would eventually announce itself, one way or another, whether anyone wanted to discuss it openly or not. The third pattern concerns the sheer sophistication of what this hour has been calling, informally, a technology of concealment, though the word technology undersells just how much genuine infrastructure sat behind it. Consider what actually had to function correctly every single day for William to appear before the king in linen bright enough to draw no comment. A laundress had to source lye and firewood and manage an entire bucking cycle across multiple days. An apothecary had to keep a supply of pumice, cuttlefish bone, and imported cloves moving through the household at a price the family could sustain. An herb seller had to maintain enough lavender and meadowsweet in stock to meet a summer's heightened demand. A comb had to be carved precisely enough to catch a louse egg smaller than a grain of rice. None of this happened by accident, and none of it happened cheaply. It was an entire supporting economy, spanning trade routes stretching toward the Mediterranean for ambergris and toward local Kentish fields for meadowsweet, all of it built to solve a single problem: keeping a body presentable and, in the era's own understanding, safe, once water itself had been placed off limits. Wealth did not simply buy comfort inside this system. It bought access to a considerably more elaborate version of the identical infrastructure everyone, rich and poor, was relying on to manage the same universal, unavoidable fact of having a body at all. The fourth pattern is the strangest, and perhaps the most humbling, because it does not flatter William's century, or ours. The entire architecture this hour has described, reasoned, expensive and truly sophisticated as it was, aimed itself with total confidence at a danger that turned out to be largely beside the point. The lice rode along regardless of the nightly comb. The fleas thrived in exactly the fur that marked a man as careful and prosperous. The actual killer moving through the Tudor countryside, whatever combination of forces truly drove the sweating sickness, paid no attention whatsoever to a closed window or a raised pomander. This is not a reason to judge William's century as foolish. It is a reason to notice how completely confidence and correctness can come apart from each other, how a person, or an entire court, can apply real intelligence, real discipline, and real resources toward a threat with total sincerity and still be aimed, through no fault of their own reasoning, in entirely the wrong direction. It is worth asking, quietly, what our own century is doing with exactly that same sincere, careful confidence, aimed at something future centuries will eventually see just as clearly as we now see William's misplaced fear of an open pore. Taken together, these four patterns point towards something larger than a single dangerous summer at a single Tudor court. They point toward the plain, recurring fact that every era manages the body with whatever tools it has, builds an entire careful civilization of habit and belief around those tools, and generally has no way of knowing, from the inside, which parts of that civilization future generations will eventually judge as wisdom and which parts they will judge as a well-intentioned mistake. William never had the luxury of that hindsight. He had only Dr. Griffith's careful advice, his wife's linen chest, his manservant's steady hands with a comb, and his own quiet, disciplined effort to keep his body as safe as his century's best available knowledge could make it. That effort deserves to be seen clearly, on its own terms, rather than filtered entirely through everything we now happen to know that he could not. Return, for a moment, to the room this hour opened inside, the steam rising slow off a tub lined in warmed linen, the herbs drifting green across the surface of the water, the candles set carefully back, the physician standing near the door with his sleeves already rolled. Henry VIII is still there, in your mind, settling his shoulders back against the sheeting, exhaling once into water that took 2 grooms and an entire relay of iron pails to fill. It looked, at the start of this hour, like the single most private and most simply luxurious moment available to the most powerful man in England. You know now that it was almost the opposite of simple, and almost the opposite of routine. You are looking at a king who bathes perhaps a handful of times in a given year, and who has, by the time this particular summer arrived, already survived one outbreak of the sweat as a young man and watched it take people around him with no warning at all. Which is why he will spend this entire dangerous season moving from house to house, sleeping in a different bed most nights, unable to shake the conviction that safety is a place you keep one step ahead of rather than a place you can simply stand still inside. You are looking at a man whose physicians have taught him, patiently and completely, that the water now closing gently over his shoulders is opening his pores to whatever corrupted air happens to be drifting through the room. Which is why the herbs are there at all. Rosemary and chamomile and sweet marjoram steeped directly into his bathwater, not for their scent alone, but as an active defense. And why a physician stands watching his color and his breathing throughout. And why he will be wrapped afterward in warmed linen and left to rest for the better part of an hour while his household quietly holds its breath around him. This is not indulgence. It is one of the most carefully engineered medical events his century can produce, built at royal expense inside a bathroom with its own boiler and its own piped hot and cold water. Precisely because even a king's wealth could only make the danger more comfortable to manage, never actually make it disappear. You also now know what this scene conceals about everyone standing just outside its walls. You know William Hart, 26 years old that summer, a gentleman of the Privy Chamber with modest land in Kent and considerably less certainty about his own future than his careful linen and his correctly trimmed beard ever let on. You know that William has not fully submerged his own body in water since before Lent, and that this gap troubles him considerably less than it would trouble a modern listener, because his physician, a careful man named Dr. Griffith, has explained to him more than once exactly what an open pore invites into a body during a summer already thick with the sweat's terrible unpredictability. You know that each morning, before William ever appears at court, his manservant Robert works a length of dry linen cloth across his shoulders and back with real, practiced force, drawing away the previous day's sweat and grime the way a modern person might rely on a shower, and that William finds the sensation bracing rather than lacking, a form of care rather than an absence of one. You know that his shirt, the whitest one in the chest each morning, is not simply an undergarment, but the actual instrument of his cleanliness, believed to draw corruption out of his body and hold it there until Alice's laundresses can boil it fully away, and that the visible whiteness at his collar and cuff is a signal deliberately displayed at court, evidence of a body properly attended to that very morning, purchased through his wife's constant, largely invisible management of a linen chest most of his fellow gentlemen never think to notice at all. You know, too, what William cannot yet know, standing in his own chamber that anxious summer. You know that the sickness terrifying his entire court, the sweat that has already claimed a groom from the king's own household and sent Anne Boleyn to her sickbed at Hever alongside her own father, will strike 4 more times across the coming decades before finally vanishing from England for reasons modern researchers still cannot fully explain. And that the fear of foul, corrupted air driving every precaution in William's day, the shut windows, the pomander raised in a crowded corridor, the strewn lavender crushed underfoot in every chamber of his house, will not be seriously challenged for another 330 years, until a London physician traces a cholera outbreak back to a single water pump, and a French chemist proves that living organisms too small to see are the actual authors of disease, and a British surgeon carries that proof directly into an operating theatre and watches infection rates fall as a direct result. William will never see any part of that reckoning. Neither will his children. He will go to whatever grave eventually receives him still trusting Dr. Griffith's careful reasoning completely, and there is no failure worth assigning him for that. He was simply born on the near side of a discovery that had not yet arrived. You know that the following year, the king will have an entire bathroom built into the Bain Tower at Hampton Court, its water piped hot and cold through England's most sophisticated domestic plumbing, and that its very existence proves not that money had defeated the era's fear of water, but that the fear ran deep enough to justify building an entire engineered defense around every single instance of indulging it. You know that 18 years further on, Henry himself will close the bathhouses of Southwark for good, the same public water that once offered ordinary Londoners a version of William's own careful ritual, finally judged too dangerous, too entangled with a disfiguring disease, to be allowed to continue at all. You know that William's own teeth, scoured each morning with powdered pumice and cuttlefish bone until they gleam the way a fashionable court expects, are being worn thinner with each careful stroke of the cloth, a slow trade he is making entirely without being told its terms, and that his fine-toothed comb worked patiently through his hair each evening by firelight catches lice that every single person around him, groom and gentleman and queen alike, is also quietly managing as an unremarkable fact of simply having hair. You know that his fur-trimmed collar, the very garment marking him as a man of means, offers an excellent home to fleas he has long since stopped noticing, and that the entire elaborate system built around his body that summer, reasoned, expensive and carefully sophisticated, was aimed the whole time at a danger considerably less relevant than the small, unremarked creatures riding quietly against his own skin. And you know that Alice, his wife, endures every one of these same beliefs under the added weight of a heavier gown, a longer head of hair, and the constant, largely uncredited labor of keeping her entire household in linen clean enough to protect everyone's reputation at once, and that the Queen herself, Catherine of Aragon, still married to Henry this particular summer, even as he works quietly toward ending it, manages an identical fear inside her own household, watching over a 12-year-old princess whose survival matters to an entire kingdom. Through the same dry cloth, the same careful physicians, the same fragile trust in scent and linen against an enemy nobody at that court can actually see. None of this makes the opening image of this hour a lie. Exactly. It only makes it considerably more complicated than a portrait was ever built to show. The king really was bathing that evening, unguarded for once, in the one room of his kingdom where his body belonged only to itself and not yet to the business of state. William really did present himself at court each morning in linen bright enough to draw admiration, his breath sweetened with clove, his collar a small, deliberate proof of discipline. Beneath every one of those surfaces sat a person managing real fear with the best tools his century had given him, tools built from centuries of careful, serious reasoning that simply started from a wrong premise about what was actually moving through the air that summer, and built an entire coherent, demanding, and remarkably human world on top of it. He is not the composed young courtier the record barely remembers, correct linen and quiet ambition, and nothing underneath worth mentioning. He is a person managing a frightened, itching, imperfectly understood body inside a dangerous season, doing it with real discipline, real care for the people depending on him, and real ignorance of the one thing that might have actually protected him, and he is, in the middle of all of that, still recognizably himself, still capable of finding real comfort in a brisk morning rub of linen cloth, still quietly vain about the whiteness of his own collar, still doing, every single day, the ordinary work of managing a body in a world that had not yet learned to see what was truly inside it. The candles in that first room have burned low by now, wherever this hour has actually left them. The water in the king's tub has gone still and cool, the herbs settled flat against its surface, the physician long since satisfied and dismissed. Somewhere else in the same palace, William is asleep, his linen fresh, his comb set aside until morning, his small silver pomander resting on the table beside him, and if you could stand quietly in that room and watch him breathe, you would be watching a man who believed, completely and reasonably, that he was doing everything right. He was not, despite the itch, the fear, and the small daily rituals built around a mistaken premise. He was simply a person in a complicated body, in a demanding world, doing what people have always done with whatever understanding their own century was able to give them. Sleep well tonight, in whatever century happens to be yours.